Good morning, everybody. It's Father John Wilson here, coming to you on this Wednesday morning, May 6th. So, as you guys know, as I've been explaining the past few days, I've undertaken a bit of a research project into, servant of God, Mary Teresa Tallon. And I've actually been, reading through her papers, reading through the accounts of her life, and kind of trying to immerse myself as much as possible in my free time in kind of that era of the history of the church, late 19th, early 20th century. And, one of the things that, is hardest to wrap my mind around, really makes me feel almost like a space alien, landing in that era, is to recognize how in that time, and really for most of the history of the church, the reception of Holy Communion was far less frequent than it is today. Mother Tallon would encourage, and even in her youth would join these, sort of pious sodalities and confraternities in her parish, for instance, where the one of the big things about this confraternity would be that they would all receive Holy Communion monthly, once a month. And this was considered a big deal that you would, support each other in doing. Some of us have been learning recently about St. Charles Borromeo in the 16th century. He was Bishop of Milan. And, they had a plague. And for 2 years, their churches were closed. And St. Charles, what he did, like some people have been calling for these days, is he actually had Mass celebrated just like out in the street, like on the street corners, and people could be watching from their homes and participating that way. But of course, they wouldn't receive Holy Communion. Like that was just not something that happened or really could happen during the plague time. But this was considered far less unusual. And people understood it was still to their great spiritual benefit even to be assisting at Mass. We know as Catholics that the Church requires us to go to confession at least once a year. But what's less well known is that even down to this day, that once a year is actually sort of paired with the fact that we're only required to receive Holy Communion once a year. And so the confession would be seen as preparation for that reception. And so we look at church history and we see less frequent reception, and we might think, well, how is this possible? There were great saints back then, even in times of far less ready access to the bread of life. What's going on there? Well, what we see very clearly is that there was not always this one-to-one correspondence, this mathematical precision between the amount of times you receive Holy Communion and the effect of Holy Communion in your life. There was a greater preparation, a greater reverence, made towards those less frequent communions. And so you could see how someone even back then could still live a powerfully Eucharistic life. But there was a problem. There was a problem, and this is something that Pope Pius X, Saint Pope Pius X, finally saw a need to address, and he did this in 1905, because there were these bitter debates among theologians. Okay, how prepared do I need to be in order to receive communion, and how frequently should I be receiving? I mean, of course, everyone agreed you should not receive if you are in a state of mortal sin. You got to go to confession first. But what about venial sin? What about my attachments to sin? What about the way that my heart is still kind of twisted? Should I be approaching the sacrament in that state? And there was debate about this. And, the common practice that arose sometimes led to this sort of twisted perception that the Eucharist is more a reward for the work you've already done in making yourself perfect, instead of the Eucharist itself being a gift of God and a remedy for sin and protection against sin and encouragement in your pursuit of holiness. And that's not the case, right? That's not what our Lord Jesus tells us, right? It's not a reward. It's a help. It's a grace. And this is why most great theologians, including St. Thomas Aquinas, throughout the history of the Church, they did affirm that the daily reception of Holy Communion is in fact ideal if you're disposed for it. It's because Holy Communion is our spiritual food, and it's our food, especially in the sense of protection against sin. Like food would replenish your body, physically, give you energy, and make you less likely to fall and collapse in the heat of the day. Right? Holy Communion is like that spiritually. And it's like that because the reception of Holy Communion itself is, in a certain sense, the perfection of charity. It's you welcoming your God into your soul. And that charity, that infusion of divine love is our safeguard against sin, right? It's like, kind of like how, how doing a good deed will sometimes bring you out of a funk and get you to stop feeling sorry for yourself. This is why for married couples, the embrace of the spouse is often very important in keeping your mind from wandering. Well, all the more so, Holy Communion is a remedy and a protection against sin. This is why, I'm just going to throw this out there. This is why, for people who are in, living situations, perhaps marriage situations, where, what the church would say is living in sin. Living in a way that, would mean you shouldn't be receiving Holy Communion. For folks in those situations, it's actually worth it to go talk to your parish priest and have him help you resolve, to refrain from each other in order to receive Holy Communion. It's actually worth it. It's actually life-giving. It will help you love in the way that you're meant to love. The Eucharist is that powerful. So this is what Pius X, was picking up on. That we need to return to this idea of the Eucharist as our daily bread. And this is certainly a powerful impulse in Mother Mary Teresa Tallon's life as well. Because it's interesting, even as a religious sister in her early life, she wasn't receiving Holy Communion daily. Maybe a few times a week. But she felt that the lack of it, and she felt that lack very powerfully. And so there was this moment that she was in San Francisco. This is like before Pius X's declaration, like early 1900s. She goes to confession, and her confessor, the priest, actually gives her permission to receive Holy Communion daily, if she desires. And because you needed actually permission from your confessor for that. And she says, and she means this, that was the happiest day of her life. It was the happiest day of her life. And because, she, living the life that she lived, pouring herself into her, into her students, and leading them in the ways of divine life, that constant energy. Like she knew what she needed, right? She needed that replenishment, that spiritual food, and she felt its effects once she started receiving, going from maybe 3 days a week to 6 or 7 days a week. And she had actually been, during and after that time, she'd actually been praying for the Pope to do what he did, to give that general permission for those who are prepared to receive Holy Communion even daily. And this isn't to say, again, that the previous era, the era of less frequent communion, wasn't an era of saints. Of course it was. But I think Pius's desire was that, well, okay, we need even more saints, and unlocking the graces of Holy Communion will do that. So that when he gave that declaration, that brought incredible joy to Sister John Berchmans, as she was then known, to her soul. But fast forward 100 years to our present time, and you don't have to hold that Pius X made a mistake when he did what he did to realize that today in a lot of countries, not everywhere in the world, but in a lot of countries, we have the opposite problem. People even approaching Holy Communion too frequently, without preparation, without really knowing what they're doing. And this is why, actually, if you actually go back and read Pius's declaration, it's really eye-opening in terms of what he teaches about the proper disposition for Holy Communion. And so this is what he says. He says, frequent and daily communion, as a practice most earnestly desired by Christ our Lord and by the Catholic Church, should be open to all the faithful, of whatever rank and condition of life, so that no one who is in a state of grace and who approaches the Holy Table with a right and devout intention can be prohibited therefrom. But then he goes on to explain, what is this right and devout intention? He says, a right intention consists in this, that he who approaches the Holy Table should do so not out of routine or vainglory. In other words, like, hey, people look at me, I'm receiving Holy Communion, aren't I holy? Or human respect. Like, oh, I got to go, otherwise I'm going to worry what people are going to think about me. But that he wished to please God, to be more closely united with him by charity, and to have recourse to this divine remedy for his weaknesses and defects. Like, wow. Right? Like, that's a lot to think about. What is my attitude? Why am I going to Holy Communion when I go? I think we have a big problem, especially with that human respect one. This is why, I'm not a real big fan of pews in our churches, or at least the common practice of having people, get up pew by pew to go receive. It's almost like we're inviting that attitude that Pius is warning us about, human respect. Like, I got to go receive Holy Communion, or else people are going to have to climb over me, and they're going to think something's wrong with me. Like, no, it's not how we should be approaching our Lord. And for all of us, this is a really good examination of conscience. When I go to Holy Communion, am I doing it out of routine? Am I doing it out of human respect? Or am I doing it out of love for our Lord and a desire to be free from sin? Now, this doesn't need to make us anxious, right? Like worried that our love for God is not yet perfect, that there might be some aspect of routine still mixed in there. Now, we don't need to be like fretting about that if we're making serious effort to keep ourselves free from sin. But, even in that moment, as you're going up to receive, know what you're doing and make it an act of love. Say, Jesus, my love for you is not yet perfect, but I do want you for you. I do want to receive you as an act of love. So now move in my soul to perfect that love, to conform me more and more to yourself. That should be our desire when we receive Holy Communion, because that's what it's there for. And to the extent that we haven't done that in the past, to the extent that we've, maybe even haven't gone to confession, haven't received worthily, or perhaps we haven't, we've fallen into those routines. I wonder if God is trying to tell us something these days by the fact that Holy Communion is far less available. Maybe he's inviting us to return to that spirit of reverence. We say, what do we say at every Mass before Holy Communion? Lord, I am not worthy to receive you, but only not worthy that you should enter under my roof, but only say the word and my soul shall be healed. Well, let's get back to that. Let's mean that prayer again. And if we do that, it'll mean that when we do finally receive Holy Communion again, it will be what it's meant to be. It will have the effect in our souls that God has always meant it to have. God bless you guys. I'll see you tomorrow.